Hey, if you're thinking, I barely have time to write, let alone start a podcast, I got you. My Start Your Author podcast checklist helps busy writers like you start a podcast without sacrificing your writing time. No more guessing or Googling. Starting is actually the easiest part of podcasting, and with this step-by-step checklist, you can fit it in over the next 6 weeks or even next weekend. Stop letting uncertainty hold you back. Grab your free checklist at the link below and get on your way to serving your target readers today. Are you growing your platform while writing your book? Maybe you're thinking of starting a podcast to attract your target readers, or perhaps you're ready to write a book with all the incredible podcast episodes you already have. Hello, raising my hand on that one. If so, I can't wait for you to meet my new friend, Dallas Woodburn, author, writing coach, and host of the Thriving Authors podcast. Dallas and I connected as I'm a listener of her podcast and was also a speaker at her recent Write Your Book Summit. I couldn't wait to have her on the show to talk about how planning your podcast is similar to how you plan your book. That was such a surprise to me, y'all. How she uses her Thriving Authors podcast to grow her own business and author platform, and how she sees authors using podcast to market their book as a host and guest. And last but not least, how she works with nonfiction authors like you in case you have a book dream on your heart. You're in for a treat today, so let's get to it. Welcome, Dallas, to Book Marketing Mania. I'm so thrilled you're here to serve my listeners today.
Thank you so much for having me, Kim. I've been looking forward to it.
I know, me too. And I already shared in the introduction how we connected and how we're both, obviously passionate about serving authors. You've got me beat though, because you're an author yourself and I'm not yet, but we both love podcasting too. So I just kind of want to talk about meshing the two of those and just get some wisdom from you of what you're seeing working for authors these days. So first off, look, like reading about writing, like I'm much better. I'd rather listen to people talk about writing and read about it than me sit down and write. But I've been so surprised, like just thinking about how you're going to structure a book, how similar it is to thinking about how you're going to have a podcast, an ongoing podcast. And so I want to talk to you about that. Just how, when you go into writing a book, how you should be thinking ahead of time of, it's not just, okay, I'm just going to write a book, right? Especially for nonfiction authors, which many of my listeners are, that you have to go into it with, like, what problem are you solving? How is this truly going to serve your reader? So will you talk a little bit about that? Because I do want everyone to think of, at the same time, your podcast is the same way, and so how they can kind of work together. And that's a lot that is laid on you, Dallas, but I'm just going to let you run with that.
Such a great insight. I love how you made that connection between writing a book and creating a podcast. I think you're so right, Kim, that it's when you're conceptualizing either a book or a podcast, it really is so much of that same strategic work that you're doing, like those questions that you brought up of who are you serving, what is your main theme or topic that you're circling around. I like to tell my people that I work with in writing a book, and maybe this applies for thinking about a podcast too, is I think sometimes it can be challenging to think of a whole big audience of people, like almost this faceless group of people that you're writing your book for or that you're creating your podcast for. But I find it can be really helpful to just think of one person. So I call it one reader. Maybe for a podcast, we think of like one listener that you are really speaking to or writing to. And sometimes it can actually be, especially for a nonfiction, if we are sharing insights that we have learned, sometimes it could even be like a past version of yourself, right? This is what I wish I would have known 10 years ago or when I was first getting started. So I encourage my clients to really narrow that down to like just this one reader, this one person. And I think that can make it a lot easier to really build out and plan out that entire book. Or if you're thinking of one listener, like your entire podcast, as opposed to thinking of like, what is everybody under the sun going to think about this, right? Sometimes that's where we can get so blocked. The other tip I have that may be useful is I call it the stones in the jar analogy. So if you imagine that you have a glass jar and you have big stones and you have smaller pebbles and then you have sand. If you were to put in all the sand first and then try to put in the small pebbles or the big stones, maybe it wouldn't all fit. But if we put in the big stones first, and then we put in the smaller pebbles, and then we put in the sand, like everything fits so perfectly into that glass jar. So I like to have my clients think about and sometimes we can get caught up in the details of the sand or the small pebbles before we really figured out what are the big stones here? What are my main ideas? What are the big things that I really feel passionate about or that I want to share? And I think whether for a book or a podcast, if we can get clear on some of those big stones, I think 5 to 7 is a great number for a book or for a podcast. Maybe those are kind of like your pillars that your episodes fall under. Then it just gets a lot easier to be thinking of the small pebbles or the sand. And I think it makes the whole process of a big project like that less overwhelming when we start with those bigger stones before we even worry about all of those little things, right? Like maybe even for a podcast, little things could be like, what's my podcast cover art going to be like? Or what brand of microphone am I going to buy, right? Some of those things that are important, but I think first we want to get clear on what are the big concepts that I'm really passionate about sharing.
Yeah, I think that's such great advice because you're right. I mean, we do get bogged down, and that's probably where I'm at. Like with writing a book, I think of all those little details versus wait, let's just think about what this book's going to be about, and what message you're trying to convey. But I love that so much because I think there's so many ways that you can use a podcast as an author, and we're going to talk about how you can work with Dallas. But I was just thinking, working with you, like writing a book, you could be podcasting kind of those concepts of what you're talking about, like the rocks and the pebbles, if those are your podcast episodes and you're building an audience while you're writing your book, or if you find Dallas after you've got a podcast, she could probably help you take your podcast and turn that into a book because you've probably been talking about all these things, but you need somebody to kind of help make it into a cohesive message. But yeah, I was just so blown away as I started just kind of reading up on things. And I was like, wow, we really need to think about this with our podcast. It would be, so much more helpful. Or if we have been podcasting, now to think about taking it to a book and maybe it's, you're just reframing things a little bit differently. But anyway, like I said, I mean, we could talk for hours about that, Dallas. It gets so passionate, but I want to hear more about your podcast, which I love listening to, the Thriving Authors podcast. So tell us, as an author yourself, how you're using that to maybe grow your own platform as well as growing your reach as an author coach too.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. I love your podcast too. Yeah, and a couple things came up for me too when I was thinking about starting my podcast. Something that has been helpful for me around podcasting, and I think is also appropriate for writing a book, is just letting ourselves kind of grow and evolve as we learn and we tweak our message a little. So with my podcast, I used to have a different name when I first started. It was called Overflowing Bookshelves, and it was just me interviewing authors. I was really missing having conversations with authors. It was during the pandemic. Bookstores weren't having author events, and I was just really missing that sense of community. And so every episode was an interview with an author, and I loved that. And I probably did close to, over 50 episodes like that. But then I started feeling more like I had more things to say that I wanted to say myself. And I had a lot of listeners writing in with questions for me about book writing and different things in the process. And I wanted to chronicle some of my journey. So then I pivoted a little bit and I changed the name to the Thriving Authors podcast. And now I have the format of solo episodes and author interviews. So it's evolved. And I think sometimes with writing a book, a common stumbling block that I see is people almost feel like they have to fit everything into that first book. They'll come to me with an idea and I'm like, you know what? I think this is actually 2 books or maybe even 3 books. And I could see this too if you have a podcast that you're trying to then turn into a book, it might be more than 1 book, right? So I think also just giving yourself a little bit of taking off that pressure. I don't have to fit every little thing right into this first book and letting yourself evolve as an author too.
So I would love to hear your expert opinion on how do you know if your idea is too big for 1 book?
Ooh, wow, I love that question. I would say this is probably a frustrating answer. Sometimes we have to get started in the writing process to really see the scope of the idea. A lot of my clients that I work with who are writing nonfiction, we work through an outline together before we really dive into all of the writing. So I would say if you're feeling like it's tough to really narrow it down to like one specific problem that you're helping to solve or like one main audience, that might mean that the book is more than one book. I think for most, especially nonfiction books, there's really that one kind of core problem or idea that we're really focused on. I would also say if you're really having a hard time with um, figuring out kind of the structure of the book or like the path, the journey that you want to take the reader on. So this might be one way that maybe the podcast format might differ a little bit from the book format. As we think of podcasts, it really is kind of this ever flowing content, right? Whereas for a book, we really do have that definitive starting place and then that ending place. And so I think sometimes clients will come to me and they'll be like, I don't know where to start, or it's hard for me to figure out the order of the journey I want to take the reader on. That can often be a sign that we're trying to cram too much into that one book. So I would say really starting with thinking of what is that one thing that I really want to teach the reader. Where is the reader starting and where do I want them to end up? Like, where do I want to leave them at the end of my book? And sometimes that can provide some clarity.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a great idea. And yeah, that's true. That is a little bit different than podcasts, unless you have a super niche one. But yeah, just thinking of, oh, yeah, where are you taking them? And like you say, when you're brainstorming, it's like if you're all over the place, that it is probably a lot, and again, if you can get somebody to kind of work with you to kind of hone it down and know that nothing's ever wasted. And that's what I really want to encourage people to. Like if there are ideas that kind of get shelved for a while that are going to be taken out of your book, that's okay. You can use those, in so many other ways, even if you don't get around to writing a second book.
Yeah. And my podcast, it's been such a great way to meet people, to network. And I think to really like find my voice and step into my own thought leadership as an author and as a coach, which talking about books, right? It's funny because that's a huge reason why people come to work with me,
Uh huh.
especially nonfiction writers, is becoming an author is such a great way to kind of up level your business, yourself, your confidence, your expertise, and your thought leadership. And I feel like creating the podcast for me has been a way to do that as well. So I do think that they can go hand in hand, right? If you have a podcast, writing a book can be that great next step. If you've written a book, creating a podcast can be that great next step. So yeah, I certainly have had people who have found me through my podcast. I have clients who have said, oh, I started listening to your podcast and I felt like I got to know you and then I wanted to work with you. And I think same is true for a book. And I also think I know for myself, I have people that I love listening to their podcast and then I want to read their book because I
Yeah.
think that our brain takes in that information in different ways. And so I would say too, if you already have a podcast, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't put out a book with some of that same information and vice versa. I think it can reach different people or even the same people. It can reach them in different ways. We consume those things in different ways. So yeah, I think it all goes so
Yeah.
well together.
That's so true. That's such a great point because I do think some people think it's either or, right? But it's not. They complement each other. And I do think like a book is the best authority, right? I mean, if you're trying to improve your authority and, be seen as a thought leader, especially like if you're trying to do speaking events or something like that, like hands down, having a book is like the best way. And then I tell people, but then if you pepper on a podcast too, like that's
Yeah.
even more, even more so. But yeah, I love, like you talked about that because I think about the authors that I read their books if they're also a podcast host, or maybe if I've heard them guesting, but it's usually if they host their own, it's like you hear their voice as you're reading those words, because you spent
Yes.
so much time with them. So yeah, I love that so much. So let's talk about on the marketing side with podcasts or even outside of it, Dallas, what are you seeing nowadays with the clients you're working with? What's working well with them to get their message out there? Do you see most of them hosting podcasts or guesting on podcasts, or do you see some other things that are, shining brighter these days?
Yeah, I think it's such a great part of a marketing plan, especially I always encourage them if there's someone who likes to talk about things, who wants to be meeting people. I have some clients who are stepping their toes into hosting podcasts. I need to connect them with you to really kind of go all in. I see a bridge that some of them are using are a platform like Substack, which it has an audio component where you can have, I think, kind of get a little bit of practice of hearing yourself speak and they begin by just kind of reading things they've written and having that audio way. And then I think as they get more comfortable speaking, then guesting on podcasts or creating their own podcast too. I always like to encourage my clients. I think podcasting, whether you're hosting or guesting, is such a wonderful way of marketing your book because it helps you reach, different audiences, like related to your book's topic, but also sometimes thinking about just that audience of readers that you're hoping to reach. And also one thing I always encourage them with podcasts is when we think about marketing a book, sometimes the efforts that we're making can seem so fleeting, right? If we're doing a social media campaign the next week, it sort of almost feels like it's a race and onto something new. Or even if we think of common book marketing things like trying to get book reviews or even magazine articles or newspaper articles or things like that, right? If someone doesn't see it when it's published, they're not really going to see it. Whereas for podcasting, someone could listen to your interview or discover your podcast months or even years after you do that recording and then find your book. And so I think when we're developing our marketing plan, it's such a nice long-term strategy too, in addition to that short-term of when the podcast is first released. So yeah, I would say the thing I'm seeing the most now is kind of the integration of like the Substack email newsletter, right, with that audio component or like a podcast component. And also I like to encourage my clients to, as we were saying, be mindful of how the book and podcast can be complementary. So if you've written an entire book, like not being afraid to use some of that content in your podcast that you're creating. So not feeling like you have to reinvent the wheel. You can really highlight content from your book, delve into that for an entire episode, or maybe you have a chapter you wrote on your book that you want to go into in a new way or give some recent examples that have just happened. So I think it can also be a nice way to make your book continue to feel relevant. If someone's listening who published a book a few years ago and they want to still bring that up, like I think having a podcast where you're talking about those concepts can really help make your book feel evergreen or really stay in the conversation.
Yeah, that's such great advice. Because I know a lot of people are fearful, like if I put this out there, like on a podcast, and they won't buy my book. But I'm sure, as we both can attest to, that's not the case. Like it never makes me not buy a book thinking, oh, it's all on the podcast. I'll just go listen. It's just, it's never the case. And like you say, it might be supplementary to what is even written in the book. So yeah, I think that's so fun. There's so many ways to go about it. Well, so I'm blown away, Dallas. Like, I mean, I could just ask you a bajillion questions, but let's talk about your services and how you serve nonfiction authors. Will you share that with us?
Yes. Yeah. So my main program I have it's a 6-month book coaching program. It's called Thriving Authors Academy. So similar to the name of my podcast. And it's hard for me to describe how magical it is. Just this, it's a small group of women who are all working on writing a book. And so I think part of it is just being in that space with other women who are chasing that same dream that you are. I think it just that energy kind of lifts you up. And it's like you don't have to be explaining to other people of why you're doing this, right? You can just kind of relax and be around other people who get it and who are going after the same thing you are. So I think it's a mix of providing coaching. So I provide a lot of, help, guidance, structure, answer questions. We all get places where we feel stuck and we just could bang our head against the wall by ourselves for a long time. But then having someone else to ask questions to can really help us move through that writer's block. So it's a mix of that and also accountability, which I know for myself with my writing, I have accountability partners. I just think it's so important to have other people there who are keeping you on track, week by week as you move through writing your book. So I have a curriculum, like if you're someone listening who really likes that structure and like curriculum of, okay, like we talked about the big stones and the small rocks, like, ooh, help me, figure out. I have that. We have weekly meetings and it's 6 months. So it's really kind of a spacious time container to be able to sink into. I have clients who go from page 1 to finishing their entire book. And I also help them do the editing and publishing and actually getting their book out in the world, during that 6 months. So it's exciting that it's expansive enough to really actually reach that goal.
Yeah, yeah, that's so good. You do. You need somebody to come alongside you, to make it happen. And like you said, the accountability or, just to be able to, yeah, answer all those questions along the way or keep you on track, like we talked about in the beginning, just of who is your book for and what are you writing it for? And, what is the reader going to get out of it? And I think it's so helpful to have somebody that can kind of look over that, along the way so you don't get so far down the journey. I think that sometimes that's what's happens is we get, we write a book and then we're like, oh, wait a minute, then you have somebody look at it and they might give you some tips on doing it differently than what you had planned on, and they're good tips. But if you had gotten help sooner, like from Dallas or somebody, it would be so much better. So, oh gosh, well, Dallas, this has been so good. I'm so appreciative of you being here and I am just like soaking it all up. And again, I'm going to put links to your podcast and to your website so they can check out your offers. And I just so appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much, Kim. It's been such a delight. I love you. I love all the work you're doing in the world. And I can't wait to read your book when it comes out. It's so exciting.
Thank you. Oh gosh, I love Dallas and can't stop thinking about her advice on not cramming too much into one book or even one podcast episode. Oh, I've struggled with that a lot over the years as a podcast host, and especially as I write my first book. And I pray this conversation was just what you needed to hear too. Thanks for tuning in to Book Marketing Mania. And as always, I'll be there for you next episode to help you reach and serve your readers one podcast at a time. See you then.